Okay, it's 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We have 44 people in our session for the course Accessibility in the ADA, the crash course for the 2021 ISA Virtual Expo. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. I know that everybody has a lot on their plate, so we'll just move to the first slide in the presentation. While Nova is U.S. based, our manufacturing is in Bryan, Ohio. That is our world headquarters. We also have operations in Doha, Qatar, Barcelona, Spain, Ankara, Turkey, and Nigeria in Africa. For those of you that don't know a lot about what Nova does, we manufacture accessible signage materials and the equipment by which they're processed. We also are an educator. We talk about accessibility in the built environment. We're an AI-approved continuing education provider, so we deliver continuing education about accessibility codes related to room identification signage. Our company was founded almost 30 years ago. And ever since that time, it's been one goal: to bring greater awareness to accessibility in the built environment and create more access to the built environment. Our products, from an architectural perspective, are considered a specialty item. That's what ADA signage is identified as, and we are in Division 10 for when we are specified. So what we're going to cover today is just what is the ADA. We'll talk briefly about California building standards and Title 24 and how that differs slightly from the rest of the ADA, general terminology, sign design restrictions, what you can do, what you can't do, and more importantly, the why behind it. We'll talk about the areas that require ADA signage, and we'll talk briefly about the technical specifications of photopolymers. So what is the ADA? Well, in a nutshell, it protects the civil rights of those with disabilities in employment and access to goods and services. And obviously, it's not just related to those with visual disabilities. We're talking ramps, we're talking pool lifts, and all of the ADA is enforced by the Department of Justice. Litigation has been increasing over the last number of years. There's been a 152% increase from 2014 and 2019. So we'll talk a little bit about the why behind that as we get deeper into it. It's not that places are being built less accessible, but facilities are being monitored more by local state officials as opposed to the general building inspector. We actually have accessibility inspectors in a number of states. We'll cover that more a little bit later. In the event that a facility is found to be non-compliant, regardless of whether it's related to ADA signs or another violation, the DOJ can fine a penalty up to $75,000 for the first violation and $150,000 for each subsequent violation. The reality of it is the DOJ is not trying to generate revenue through these penalties. Quite frankly, it's a hammer to initiate compliance with the law, so that way the built environment is more accessible. Because at the end of the day, even if you do get a fine, you will have to make your facility ADA compliant. So it's more of a lever than it is a revenue generation. Let's talk a little bit about the states in the ADA. On all projects, as we talked about before, are protected under the federal ADA. However, a state can modify their building code with approval from the Department of Justice. In the context of that is like California, that we'll talk about briefly in a few slides. They made their codes more restrictive, or they've made their codes in a way that allow for greater accessibility to the built environment than the federal guidelines. That's the context in which someone can modify the code. In a previous slide, we talked about the increase in litigation and the why behind that. Today, 10 states have accessibility inspectors that their only goal in life is to inspect the building for compliance with accessibility codes. Whereas in the past, the general building inspector would walk in, they're checking electrical, different code requirements, and signage, quite frankly, wasn't near the top of their list of things to check. that has changed. The 10 states now are Texas, California, New Jersey, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Washington, Maine, Florida, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. So the ADA codes really haven't changed since 1991, at least as it relates to ADA signage. There's been no fundamental changes. However, what the ADA does is address things like the rest of the world that we live in, right? We live in a world that is a bell curve where there is black and white on one end, the absolutes on both areas, but we really live in a world of gray in the center of that bell curve. And the ADA addresses codes in that same way. It tries to give you general guidelines. It talks about why you're doing certain things so that you can make some decisions on your own, because as buildings get more complex, you can't have a code or guideline for every single circumstance that you might encounter. So when you find yourself in those situations, the best thing to do is build a relationship with the local inspector. Bring them into the decision-making process. If you have something that is not an absolute in the ADA, bring them in, have a conversation with them, let them know what you're proposing to do, and get their buy-in on that. So when it comes time for the actual inspection, if there's any questions, you've already started to broker that relationship. Compliance with the ADA codes and building a relationship with your inspector is really no different than normal life, where you're building relationships with your employees or your neighbor or anything else. So as it relates to the ADA and signage, there are two distinctly different groups of people, the blind and the visually impaired. And those two different groups definitely have their own set of needs. First, we'll start with the blind. The blind actually need things to be where they expect them to be. They literally cannot see. The visually impaired can see, but with a greater level of difficulty. About 75% of those over the age of 65 have some level of visual impairment. So when we talk later about contrast, light on dark, dark on light, those type of things, that's the why behind that. So what type of signs are governed by the ADA? Predominantly room identification and wayfinding signage. Wall-mounted signs that are the identification of permanent rooms and spaces. The type of signs that are exempted, as an example, are temporary signs, such as building directories, hours of operations, those things that are likely to change. Here's an example of something that lives in that gray area. This sort of defines a air quotes, permanent space, but Molly is in a cube. And Molly could be moved from cube to cube to cube rather easily based on the mobility of that sign. So Molly, Etherington does not have an ADA compliant sign because that's an exception from the ADA. Another thing the ADA talks about is the tactile characters and the required Braille. ADA compliant signs that identify permanent rooms and spaces must have both of those attributes. The tactile has to be 1/32 of an inch raised from the base with grade 2 Braille. The tactile character height minimum is 5/8 of an inch and maximum of 2 inches. And the why behind that is when you're going to trace the outline of the letter, you want it to be big enough to be able to distinguish what the letters are. Because only about 3% of the people in the world are blind, and only about 3% of that 3% actually read Braille. You might ask why that is. Generally, people lose their vision once they have already learned to read. So rather than learn a completely new language, which Braille is, they trace the outline of the letters that they're already familiar with. That is why the size requirements are what they are. As it relates to pictograms, the pictogram has to fit within a 6-inch field. Again, it has to be separate from where the tactile and Braille is. And the pictogram size, again, goes to the field so that you can trace the outline. Braille dots shall have a domed or rounded shape. That is the message that was in the ADA when it was originally started, and it has not changed since that time. We won't bore you with reading all of the statistics here about the dimensions and the requirements for braille and spacing, but this slide is really meant to demonstrate that there are very specific close tolerances as it relates to what the braille dot shape and size should be. Now, the braille should be contracted or grade 2 braille and separated by 3/8 of an inch minimum from any other tactile characters. And we talk about the contracted grade 2 because that's what's in the federal ADA guidelines. California braille is slightly different, and we'll talk about that a little later in the presentation. Braille position. This is a question that we get a lot. Braille should be below the corresponding text, separated by 3/8 of an inch. Just because you see something in the built environment that has Braille to the right or to the left of the number, seeing it just means it's wrong. It doesn't mean that you weren't aware that you could do it some different way. So you might ask, why would the Braille be below? Why isn't it required? Why isn't it allowed to be to the side? The simple answer is gravity. When you reach out to where you expect that sign to be and you are feeling the numbers, gravity takes place and your hand naturally drops and you naturally find the Braille located between the tactile numbers. We talked about those with visual disabilities and contrast being important. We want light on dark and dark on light. You wouldn't want to, go into a W hotel and have a black sign with a charcoal gray raised characters, right? That's not going to have any contrast. It's going to be difficult for someone in a low light or vision deficiency. It would be very difficult for them to read. The characters and their background should also have a non-glare finish for the same reason that I mentioned previously. Dual message signs. This is a great way to be ADA compliant and then perhaps carry the font associated with your brand through your signage. At the top, we have marketing public relations, where it's light on dark, dark on light on dark, dark on light. And we have a font that would be non-compliant, right? The letters are almost touching. They're not thin stroked, but down below, we have the same message with Braille 3/8 inch below the tactile lettering, where the font is a thin stroke, widely spaced, but that doesn't contrast, right? So the top part of that sign is for those folks with visual disabilities. The bottom part of that sign are for people that are completely blind. The mounting height is 48 to 60 inches from the finished floor or ground. The reason for that, the why behind that is the average reach height of a standing person and also the average reach height from someone sitting in a mobility device. This is just an example of a sign being mounted at the proper height on a glass door. Sometimes we get questions about, well, what if there's a glass panel to the right of the door? Where do we mount the sign? You mount the sign on the glass panel. Just another rendition to help you understand some of the dimensions around mounting the sign. So if there are double doors and you have obviously a need for the sign should be center mounted on the inactive door, again, 48 to 60 inches off the floor. That's for safety reasons. The international symbol of accessibility. We see the original in the upper left corner. That's something that we've all seen as we navigate the built environment. And that was created a number of years ago. And the international symbol of accessibility, not the US symbol of accessibility. So as folks that used to be what was once referred to as wheelchairs live their life in a more active way in mobility devices, playing sports, navigating the environment the same way that the rest of us do in many ways, the symbol of accessibility has changed to reflect the more mobile person. While that's not the international symbol of accessibility, ANSI and ISO have approved these symbols to be used. There would be no fines levied if you are using the symbols that we see below the original to reflect those folks in mobility devices. So this is something that we see more and more, and it celebrates the advancement of the mobility devices and the access that that provides. So California Code Title 24. In this instance, the grade 2 Braille has wider spacing between the Braille cells. In Title 24, the Braille is still a 3/8 inch minimum, but also a 1/2 inch maximum from the tactile lettering. Restroom signs. For all gender restrooms, there must be not only a sign mounted on the latch side of the door, 48 to 60 inches, but you also must have a square background, a circle, and a triangle mounted on top of that to identify that location as well. Now, briefly, a little bit about photopolymer. As it relates to Nova, we currently have 6 core product lines that really is a variance of base materials, allowing for greater design. How's the material made? Well, polymer, a 1/32 inch layer of polymer, is extruded to a variety of base substrates. So the beautiful thing about this process is you're going to get consistency. The sign that you make today will match the sign that you make 3 years from now, maybe for another building on a campus at a university. Consistency is really important. Productivity is really important, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. There are other ways to manufacture ADA compliant signs. Polymer is the way that you're going to be guaranteed consistency every single time, because the 1/32 layer identified by the ADA never changes with photopolymer. So how do we do it to make sure that polymer doesn't perform maybe like other processes do, like mechanical processes? Polymer has an integral bond between the polymer and the base substrate. You can sort of see that depicted on this particular image very, very well from the side view. The polymers are actually cross-linking when they're exposed by UV light. There is a photoreactive process with photopolymer when you're processing it. So those polymers cross-link and actually occupy a smaller space. And through that cross-linking, they're actually etching in or biting into the base substrate. And the way we can say that it is an integral bond, because when we use ASTM shear test methods, the bond between the two materials is stronger than the surface of either material that is being bonded together. So when there is, under extreme pressure, a fail, the material itself breaks apart before the bond between the two materials do. That is how we can refer to this as an integral bond. So the primary base of most of our materials is PET, PETG. What is PETG? PETG is the same material that water bottles are made out of. It's sent to our recycling facilities and can be incorporated into post-industrial waste content materials. Our material starts off at 40% post-industrial waste. So how do you fabricate? Step one is you create a film negative out of software that hopefully is guaranteeing ADA compliant files, recognizing the fonts, the stroke width, those type of things for the reasons that we talked about earlier. Nova does have a software called Workflow Manager that guarantees that you're going to make an ADA compliant file. The next step is to expose it with UV light. It's done under vacuum, so you get intimate contact between the emulsion of the film negative and the photopolymer layer. The exposed light goes through the clear areas of the film, cross-linking those polymer molecules. The rest of the polymer that did not get hit by ultraviolet light remains soft and is simply washed away in plain tap water. That wastewater effluent that is washed away can go in every public waste disposal system in the world. The next step is to simply dry the moisture off the surface of the material to make sure that there's no water spots that would cause problems when you're in the finishing process. And the final step is a post-exposure to cure the polymer all the way through the middle, ensuring that you do have an integral bond. Our material can help contribute toward a building receiving LEED certification. Materials are not LEED certified. Buildings are LEED certified. Buildings are certified as LEED certain levels based on the number of points they get, based on the materials that are used to construct that building. So it relates to NovaCryl. We get a LEED credit, or the building contractor gets a LEED credit for leadership in energy and environmental design. EQ credit 401, low emitting materials and adhesives. We want that indoor air quality to be fantastic for the building occupants. And we also get an MR credit 401 for recycled content, because we're at least 10% post-consumer material. And because of the unique nature of our material and the design aspects that it affords the user, we get an ID credit 1 and 1.4 for innovation and design. We also have BIM objects for all of our materials. Fun fact, Nova was the first company in the signage industry to have BIM objects for our products. And BIM objects are really virtual objects that have material attributes applied to them, so that they can lay them in the virtual building. You can actually see how that building is going to, how you can walk through that building before it's physically built, run some models to see how it's going to perform as it relates to indoor air quality and the like. Every federal project, every project that receives federal funding must have BIM objects for the materials that are used in their project. So it's been almost a decade since Nova developed the BIM objects for the products that we have. So what are the advantages of photopolymer over other mechanical processes? This is a sign that was done with a mechanical process, meaning standard base material and some self-adhesive material with letters cut out and glued on. You can see how the letters pick off of this material. Now, if done properly, these signs are very durable. The reality of it is, though, oftentimes they're not done properly, so you end up with something like this. This process is also a good bit more time consuming than the photopolymer process. Which leads us to the productivity level of photopolymer. This is from one of our sign fabricators. Very high level of productivity. You're going to be able to produce over 400 signs per shift, and that's an 8x8 sign. Oftentimes, you know, this is just to demonstrate the productivity. The reality of it is you're not going to be making 400 signs every shift, every day, every week. But we all know that the demand for signage comes in at the last moment. The files get approved at the last moment. You need the signs up to get your occupancy permit. So being able to produce a consistent, high quality sign in a short period of time is going to help you meet your clients' needs, and also is going to help you control labor costs. So to wrap up, just some final comments. ADA compliant signs manufactured using PET polymer meet all the US and international laws and standards, including the Title 24 and the 2010 accessible standard for design. And I mentioned that all over the world because we have these signs on every continent. Accessible ADA compliant signs manufactured using PETG have a 0.001 moisture ratio. So even in high moisture conditions, the signs have great structural integrity and will not fail. One of our largest customers only makes signs for cruise ships, ADA compliant signs for cruise ships, and they are using NovaCryl. ADA signs made using PET polymer meet or exceed all the burn and vertical burn standards for internationally. And finally, signs using PET polymer are integrally constructed, single piece constructed based on the shear test method testing that we discussed earlier. So, fun little pop quiz here. Let's see if everybody's been paying attention. Is the sign you're looking at ADA compliant? We don't have live back and forth here on this. So the answer to that question, think about it for a moment. The answer is no. There is no braille on this sign. that sign is also not mounted within the proper distance from the jamb of the door. That sign should be mounted on the glass as opposed to a distance from the outside jamb. So is this sign ADA compliant? Yes, it is. The permanent location is tactile and the braille is underneath of that tactile. Is this sign compliant? Again, the answer is no. Notice the font that had been used. It's a very stylized font. The letters are very close together and the braille is almost touching the letters. So that sign would not be compliant for the reason I mentioned. Is this sign ADA compliant? Well, the sign's pretty far away, so we can't tell whether it has braille or not, but the sign is actually mounted on the door and it is not mounted on the latch side of the door 48 to 60 inches off the ground. So that sign would not be compliant. Is this sign ADA compliant? Again, same reason. The sign is not compliant. It's a sign mounted on the door opposed to the latch side. So think about what the maximum fine is for each ADA violation. Do we remember what that was? $75,000. That concludes the presentation for the crash course for ADA guidelines. Melissa, were there any questions that came in during the presentation?
Was one. Let me scroll up before your questions.
Actually, we've got a couple. The first one was from Amanda. Is there a maximum height for the copy to be off? The minimum is 1/32. Is there a maximum?
No, the ADA code specifies 1/32 of an inch and does not apply a tolerance.
And then the other question was just
So
from Cliff wanting to know if he could download this presentation somewhere.
Sure, Cliff, the entire presentation, we sort of did an abbreviated one here today because of the time constraints, but we have our full unabbreviated conversation available on our website. Melissa, perhaps you could pull that up real quick and share that link in the chat for you to be able to either view it as a flipboard type of presentation or actually download the PDF.
Sure.
And then Kelly Campbell is asking what equipment and resources are needed to make photopolymer ADA signs.
Sure. If you're a typical sign company, you have a good bit of what you already need to manufacture ADA signs. What you would need is a photopolymer processor. We manufacture that here in the USA in Bryan, Ohio, which is where our manufacturing facility is. We're using robotic technology to make our photopolymer materials, and we have an engineering team that manufactures our photopolymer processor. Many people will also choose to purchase a hot stamp device to more efficiently apply color to the raised graphics. You can screen print as well. Oftentimes people shy away from screen printing and prefer the hot stamp method, as a lot of productivity can be realized there, and it gives you a very, very architectural finished look to the raised copy. I mentioned Workflow Manager as a software as well, that you can simply take a room schedule file, drop that in as a CSV or Excel file, and Workflow Manager will build those files for you, step them up, gang the files in a way that helps you minimize material waste. So those are the primary things that you'd typically purchase as a sign company. Obviously, you're already painting. You already have a CNC or a router to cut the sign panels apart.
All right. Emmett Burson, does the 3/8 inch distance from the braille to the lettering include the descender of a character, or is it just the cap height?
It is the cap height.
So Brian, or excuse me, Brooke Gongora, Brian Burt asked 2 minutes ago, I've heard 3D ADA signs often are accepted by GCs in lieu of photopolymer. Have you seen this to be true?
What type of signs? I'm
3D
sorry.
printed. I'm assuming we're talking about the
Sure,
printed signs and not actual 3D signs.
Printed signs, regardless of what the manufacturing method is to produce the signs, they need to comply with the ADA standards, right? So the ADA standard says you have to have tactile that's 3/8 of an inch. You have to have braille separated from the tactile by 3/8 of an inch. And you must have a contrast, light on dark or dark on light. So as long as those signs meet the guidelines of the ADA, manufacturing method does not dictate whether a sign is compliant or not. Material doesn't dictate whether a sign is compliant or not. It's simply the standard. Does the material have a smooth background? Is there good contrast? Do we have the right character height? Is it 3/8 of an inch in tactile? Is the braille done correctly? So that hopefully answers the question.
Going off of that, how does the braille needing to be domed work with photopolymer? In my experience, they come out more cylindrical than domed with photopolymer.
Sure, good question. So oftentimes what you'll see is when you underexpose polymer, when you're exposing through the film negative, when you expose it for an example, 1 minute, it's going to look very much like a column. The more you expose, the more the light seeps through, and that's how you get the perfect shape of a braille dot. As you coat, as you finish your sign, what's going to happen when you spray is more of that paint is going to land on the top of the dot than it does on the side of the dot, and that's what gives it the very smooth finish. But even without the top coat that I referenced, polymer was an acceptable way to manufacture ADA signs back in 1991 when the ADA was signed into law, and that ADA hasn't changed any since 1991. The shape of polymer, rounded and domed and rounded is what the ADA says. Domed is used to represent the shape of polymer. Round is used to represent the shape of a raster bead. So it's either one of those two things or anything in the middle. The primary issue is making sure that it's 3/8 of an inch and the braille cells are spaced appropriately.
Juan Diaz asked about section 703.3.2 braille position. If there is a room ID or restroom combo sign on a single faceplate, where would the braille for the room ID be positioned? Under the raised room ID tag, raised text.
Those would really require, if they are location, it would go under the last identified portion of the braille sign. However, those would be two very odd shared locations. Those would typically need two different signs. And in general, if we have a sign that says Office of Orthopedic Surgery, and we also have a room number that says 214, the braille would go under room 214, as from a fire and safety and rescue perspective. 214 is the permanent location of that room in the directory that would be used for fire and rescue.
Alex Wozniak, are stairwell ID signs required to list stairwell 1A, etc., and are they required to say exit on them?
From the ADA perspective, as it relates to permanent rooms and locations, the ADA code really going to apply to that doorway that leads into the stairwell. That would be the sign that would need to be raised, characters and braille. The doorway leading into that stairwell. Different building inspectors, code inspectors, fire inspectors vary on their interpretation of what's needed within that stairwell.
Stephen asked, I thought the sign could be mounted on the wall rather than the glass because the distance away from the latch side is a minimum requirement. Is that true? So I guess if you've got glass beside a door.
Right.
On the wall rather than the glass.
Generally speaking, you're going to find that code inspectors are going to want that glass, that sign mounted on the glass. They're going to want that to be off of the actual door jamb, because it would be very difficult. Think about it from a practical matter. If you're someone that is blind, walking into, approaching a door, how you're going to, and every other door that you walk into, one, you're not going to know that that's a glass pane. When you raise your hand to look for that sign, and you become accustomed to where those signs are located. When you reach your hand up looking for the sign, if that sign is not at the normal place, you're not going to know that that's glass, and you're not going to know how far you need to keep going until you find that sign. So from a practical matter, you almost always see the signs mounted on the glass, away from the jamb.
Where can they get the BIM objects?
Sure, BIM objects can be downloaded from novapolymers.com. You can download our BIM objects there. You can also download the BIM objects from arcat.com, ARCAT. ARCAT stands for Architectural Catalog. That is the largest repository of research for building materials, and our BIM objects are hosted there as well.
I posted a link in our chat window as well.
Thank you, Melissa.
You're welcome.
I think that's it, unless anybody's got any other questions.
Well, fantastic. We appreciate everybody being here with us today. Hopefully we've added a little bit of insight into the ADA codes. Again, we're always, all year long, we're always here to reach out to if you have a question. We do all that we can to try to provide assistance, whether you use our materials or not. We just want a more accessible built environment. So enjoy the rest of ISA's virtual expo. We're so happy that at least we can be together like this. Can't wait to see everybody, all of our friends and partners, face to face next year. Stay safe, everybody, and thank you all very much for being here today. Take care.